Hi, Dave Scotland for AE Tutes, and today we're going to take a look at some workflow tips. These are some tricks that I've used in a production environment just to save some headaches and to really give you some options that can save valuable time when you're working to deadlines. And the first one I'm going to show you is using the RPF file type. You can also use an RLA file type for many of the things I'm about to show you. Now, what's unique to an RPF file type is that it actually holds channel information, and that channel information is set up out of the 3D application that you might be using, and just about any 3D application will allow you to save as an RPF file, and during that save process you actually set up the channels that are stored in the file. I've got a file here. It's I'll just show you what it is. It's just a very simple sort of 3D logo that I've put together, and it's made up of a number of different objects. And if you look over in the project window here, you can see that it's trillions of colors plus pre-multiplied. It also has Z depth, material effects, object ID, and Z coverage. Now, that might not mean a lot to people at a glance, but they're very powerful options, and there are a bunch of other channel information that can be saved in an RPF file. Now, we'll take a look at the power of just some of these basic ones here. If this was just a TGA render or a TIFF render, basically you would be stuck with what you have in the render, and if you wanted to make subtle changes to individual elements within that render, you would have to go back to your 3D application, make the change, and then re-render the shot. And if that's a 500 frame or 1,000 frame render, you could be waiting quite a long time to render that out. What I'm going to do is just drag this down onto a new composition, and so we've got our new comp there. I might try and give myself a little bit more space in the window here. Just come in a little bit. Now, what I can actually do, because it's an RPF file, and I have assigned all of the grey letters, the ones that are closest to camera, I've assigned those a unique material ID, or object ID, sorry. And if I highlight it, you can see I've got material effects, I've got object ID. So if I highlight the layer, right click, 3D channel, and I'm going to come down to ID matte. Now, straight away, the text disappears, and if I toggle the transparency, you'll see there's nothing in the shot, even though the layer is visible in the timeline. What's actually happened is it's set currently to object ID 0, and nothing in the shot has been saved out of 3D with an object ID of 0. What I've in fact done is set the object ID of the various elements starting at 5. So you'll see there that it's just the grey areas of the logo. If I go to 6, it's the red elements, and if I go to 7, it's the thin band that sort of goes around the red elements. Now, there is a little bit of sort of anti-aliasing happening, and that is something that you need to be cautious of when you use this method. But you can use a little bit of feather, and you can also choke the effect in a little bit, and you can 9 times out of 10 you can get what you're looking for. So what I'm going to do is just duplicate this layer, Control D, and the bottom layer I'm just going to use as my base layer. I'm going to delete that ID matte, and I'm going to hide that layer. So the top layer, I'm going to go back to ID 5, and what I'm going to do is just try to radically change this this effect, or try to radically change this logo. And I'll go down, we'll do a little bit of color correction. I'll put a hue and saturation on, and we'll colorize, and you'll see straight away if I unhide the base layer, those other elements aren't affected by the changes that I'm making. So I might come a little bit more saturated and wind it around. Might go for a green color there. And what I can actually do is duplicate that layer again, Control D. Now we'll leave the green layer on top because it's closest to camera, and we'll just hide that for a second. And I'm going to select the layer underneath, and I'm going to change the material ID to 6. And notice it's popped to where the red was, and it's now turned green. So I can change the color, maybe go to, say, a purple and give it a little bit more saturation. And I might even just give it a little feather, little one pixel feather, and maybe even just brighten that up a little bit. And now I can unhide the green, and you can see that we've already radically changed that that logo. And so we might as well do the last layer, which is this sort of thin band around here. And I'll go to the top, Control D, and we'll hide the top layer. We'll change, we're on the second from the top layer there, and I'm going to change that to Material ID 7. And if I isolate that, it's just that thin band. And we might go for maybe a yellow color, something like that. Really ramp up the brightness, and unhide the top layer. And I think what we'll do is just give it a little bit of feather on that, just to hide that anti-aliasing that's happening there. There are different methods that we can use to sort of tidy up that anti-aliasing, but in this instance it's not really what I wanted to show you for this sort of tip. And if I double click on the project here and just drag this over, you'll see from where we were to where we are, it's a radically different color treatment. But the important point is that this entire project only used one render, and that's some of the power that RPF rendering can actually give you. What I'm going to do is show you another use of the RPF file. And I've got this other file who will create a new composition, and I'll just hide this one here. Now we've got the same logo, but they may look like it's a large one, medium size, and a small one, but they're actually further away from the camera. They're all exactly the same size in 3D space, just the smaller one is the furthest away from the camera, and the large one is up close. So just with that isolated, we'll go to our effects window. I'm just going to go 3D channel, and I'm going to go depth matte. And straight away it disappears. And once again, there's nothing visible in the shot, yet it is still visible in the timeline. And by dragging into the negative, which is back into the scene from the position of the camera, we can actually hide and unhide relative to how close an object is to the camera. So as I'm dragging into the negative, I'm unhiding more and more of the scene. So what that allows me to do is actually isolate, say I've got a group of characters in the background and another group of characters up close, and I want to do something in post-production specifically to something that's further away from the camera. Well, this RPF method can really be helpful, and it means that you don't need to go and render those as separate passes. So say for instance I want the middle logo to be a certain color. What I can actually do is drag the depth into the negative until it's visible, and then I'm going to highlight that effect, Control D to duplicate, and I'm going to invert and drag further into the negative, back closer to the camera, and straight away between -1200 and -590 is where that logo sits in relation to Z depth, or distance from the camera. And so just using those two effects there, I've isolated that. Now imagine if this was a moving object, I would need to rotoscope that object, and that can be quite painful. This method allows you to do it without having to rotoscope that object. So I can then duplicate that, Control D. The bottom one, I can get rid of the depth matte, and the top one, I can maybe put, let's put a color correction, and let's put a tint on it, Actually, we'll go a hue and saturation similar to the last example, and we can colorize that. We can do all sorts of things to that. Bring up the saturation there, go for a different color, something like that. Maybe even darken it down. We could even put some sort of blur effect on it. Maybe even just go for a simple fast blur. Repeat on edges and just give it a blur. Something like that. And you'll see that we can isolate certain things within the shot using that effect depth matte. So we'll take the same shot again, the same render again. Just drag the RPF file onto a new composition button, and so just the one layer, and we've got our composition there. We can do, using that RPF, we can use our Z depth figure, and we can highlight the layer, and we can add a 3D depth of field. Now what I like to do with depth of field to really sort of assess where the Z depth is of an object, I'll really crank the radius up. I tend to go to just straight to 10, and it throws everything in the shot into a blur. I'll put the focal plane thickness at a fairly sort of smallish number, which in this instance I'll just use 50. And then I'll start to go into the negative. And watch, as I go into the negative, I'm pushing that focal plane, which is where it is not in blur, back away from the camera, and it starts to pick up the geometry. You'll see that it picks up the large logo first, and then it goes to the second logo, and then the third logo furthest away. So I could basically isolate that second logo there, and then obviously bring the radius down to something that's a little bit more practical, maybe 2. And then I could also throw up the focal bias, which just that blending from blur to sharpness is a lot more accurate using a higher focal bias number. And if I zoom in a little bit, you'll see that we have a nice depth of field effect happening where the close object is in blur, our focused object is nice and crisp, and then the object furthest away is also in blur. And I could even bring the thickness of the plane down. I could go to, say, 10, and just find that point where 10 covers our object. Might have to go up a little bit more, say 20. And you're just using the focal plane to come to that middle. There it is there. And you'll see that some of that second logo is sharper than other parts, which is exactly the way it was designed in 3D. Some of those letters are actually closer to the camera than other parts of the logo, and so by having a smaller focal thickness, we can actually bring the depth of field even tighter and really sort of exaggerate that effect. I'm going to go with 30, and I'm just going to push it maybe minus 920, and that's going to keep it nice and crisp there, and you'll see that it gives it quite a nice effect. Now the next one I want to show you is an editing technique that I use. Now I use After Effects to do a lot of editing of footage. I do a lot of post-production with After Effects, and therefore it's handy to do any sort of re-editing in After Effects without having to jump into another application. Now Premiere's fine, but if you're really used to the After Effects environment, then it pays to have a little bit of a technique to do some quick editing. So I've got this showreel footage here. I'm just going to drag it down onto new composition so that we maintain the aspect ratio. I'm just going to come through to a little bit of footage. We'll go to this first shot here, and what I can actually do is double click on the footage down in the timeline, and it brings up our footage layer. I'm just going to drag it over to the side so we're shared, and what you're looking at, the left hand side is our composition, and the right hand side is the actual footage itself. Now I can set, using these two set in point and set out point buttons, I can set the in point so that the very first frame of my composition is at this frame. and I can just click that, and you'll see now that on the timeline, my very first frame is that frame. Now I can come in on my timeline, go to that point where I want to punch in some new footage, which is about there, and then what I use is Control-Shift-D. And what it does is it cuts the footage at that exact frame, and it puts a new version of that exact layer above the original layer at that point. And then I can double click on that layer that's just been created, and you'll see here that the footage starts from that point. If I go one frame in, it's at that new piece of footage. So I can then scrub through and find my next piece of footage that I want to include in the comp, and say it's there, and then I just punch the in point button, and you'll see in my comp now that it flows perfectly into that next piece of footage. And then I can come through in my comp until the next bit of footage that I want to punch in, and I can go Control-Shift-D. It does the same operation again. Double click on the top layer, drag across, and find the next piece of footage that I want to include. Say it's say we want to put this piece here in. I can hit the set in point button, and now you'll see my composition actually flows through those three pieces of footage. And so basically it's a method of just slashing the film, slashing the footage, and then creating a duplicate of the original footage above at that slash point. And then by double clicking it, you're working in the footage window here to set a new in point for your footage. So that's a very handy way to edit footage on the fly while you're in After Effects. Give it a try. I think it's a real time saver. Now the next one I want to show you, we're going to use this composition that, keep an eye out for this tutorial. It's an up and coming tutorial with AE Shoots, and I think Adam, the editor of AE Shoots, has got a nice surprise for people coming up with this particular tutorial. But basically, I wanted to show you something that I use a lot, and the reason why I use it is that when you include motion blur in a 3D render process, that is rendering out of 3D with motion blur built in, two things will happen. First of all, you're going to blow out your render times immensely, and I mean like a factor 10 on your render times out of 3D. And the main thing that is a real pain to deal with is that you're stuck with that level of motion blur. If you want to really push it or lighten it a little bit, you can't, because it's baked into the actual render. So I use a plugin called Real Smart Motion Blur, and I'm going to show you exactly how it works, or exactly how I tend to use it. Now, obviously things are moving. We've got missiles actually flying away from this bomber here, and I want those missiles to really read as being more believable in this scene. So I'll find the layer that they're on, and it's that particular layer there, and I'm just going to highlight it, go to my effects control. I've already got a depth matte and brightness and contrast, and when you get your head into this tutorial later on, when it's released, you'll see exactly what all these other effects are about. But I just want to deal with some motion blur, and I'm just going to right click, and I'm going to add my Real Smart Motion Blur plugin, and straight away, if I switch it on and off, there's a much more believable feel to the moving elements within the scene. Now you'll see that there are various elements, like the ship itself is not moving very fast, so it only has a very, very tiny amount of motion blur. If I switch that on and off, you can just see it on the ship, but you can definitely see it on these faster moving objects. So I'm just going to switch it on. I'm going to go motion blur amount. I'm just going to go 0.35, and then on the motion sensitivity, I'm going to knock that back to 50. See what we have there, and it's looking okay. Now, if I take the isolation off, you'll see that it's not quite right, because we do have another layer, which is this missiles layer, and you'll see the difference between the missiles and the missiles layer, the missiles comp. It actually has these tail, this smoke element. It's got some glows and things like that. We need to add that motion blur to that layer as well to really tie it all together. So I'm just going to highlight it, Control C to copy, go to the other layer, Control V, and it just helps bring everything together in the scene. Now, I think Real Smart Motion Blur is something that every 3D, every After Effects user should have in their arsenal. But if you are using 3D elements out of a 3D package, you definitely need to use a post-production motion blur plugin to really free up a lot of that render time that 3D rendering of motion blur will cause. And this is a very good one because it actually has it allows motion source, and I could actually bake out a render that has velocity information for moving objects, and the motion source, I would load that velocity file or load that render into that motion source slot, and it would be more accurate with its motion blur. It would be based on the velocity. So definitely have a look at Real Smart Motion Blur, and it will save you an incredible amount of time. Now the next one I want to show you is a great feature that a lot of people might have overlooked, and you may have. I'm just going to open up a PSD file that I have here, which is a Photoshop file. I'm just going to bring it in, and I'm going to tell it to be a composition, and I'm just going to leave. I'm not going to worry about crop layers. I'll leave it as a composition. Editable layer styles, I'll leave that in case I want to change the layer styles, because I've got text in this particular composition. In fact, this is what the composition looks like, and it's just some simple text on a gradient background, a little bit of gratuitous advertising for CG SWAT, and basically by bringing it in as a comp, it's created a composition, and this is the comp down the bottom here, and we've got the two layers, the background layer and the text. Well, straight away I've got that text, and I'm not real happy with it once I start to incorporate some other effects and some other layers. I want to change the font for that particular layer. So I'm just going to bring up the visibility here of my characters or fonts. Just drag this over so we can see it a little better. And I can't change, if I click, if I double click, it comes up in the footage window here, so it's reading, After Effects is reading it as footage, and I can't change that font. But what a lot of people have overlooked is if I right click that, there is an option here that says convert to editable text. And if I click on that, it's now text. And you'll see the little icon in the layer name down here has changed to text. And if I double click, I can actually change the text here. And it's maintained the layer style that I've created. It's maintained the size, and it's literally text as if it was the same as it was in Photoshop. So basically, what that allows me to do is do a lot of layout work in Photoshop. Especially when it's image-based layout work, or I'm working with a lot of text that I want to include a lot of layer styles, and I can do that in Photoshop and then bring that in as a comp and just convert the text elements into editable text, and then I can really do whatever I want to that text, and I can double click and change the font. I can do all sorts of work to it as if it was normal text. So that's definitely something that you should be aware of if you're not already aware of it. It's a very powerful tool if you do a lot of layout work in Photoshop. So give that one a try. Okay, so the last one that I wanted to share with you is a nice little script that comes built in with After Effects, and I use it sometimes, especially when I have, I'll take for instance one of this particular comp is from the Building Leap tutorial that on AE Tutes, and some of these comps get very heavy. This one here, I mean, it's got, what, 15 layers. It's not uncommon that you can have up to 30, 35, or sometimes even 50 layers in a comp. Now, let's just say that this particular comp, you'll see, is, if I highlight it, it's 1280 by 720. And I want to crank this down. My output doesn't need to be that high. In fact, I want it to be 720 wide rather than 720 high. And I want the resolution to be relative. Now, I could simply just go up and say composition, come down to comp settings, and then just make sure the tick box is in the lock aspect ratio, and then just change the width to 720. Now you'll see what happens. If I go OK to that, the comp size has changed, but all of the layers in the comp, obviously not the audio layers here, but all of the layers in the comp are still at their original resolution. And I would need to go in individually. If I just hit S for scale, it's at 100% at the moment. I would have to scale each layer down until it fits in the comp, or I could right click and say transform fit to comp, but I would need to do that to all of the layers. Now I'll just undo that, and I'll undo the resize of the comp. So we're back here and it's still 1280 by 720. If I come up to File, come down to Scripts, there's a real handy script, and you really should have a look at these scripts if you haven't used them before, because you know these come built into After Effects. I'm just going to go Scale Composition. Now, if I click Scale Composition, what it actually runs off is the comp that is selected in the project window over here. And at the moment, I've got the master comp selected, so I can actually give it a scale factor, which is it's 1 at the moment. I could make it 0.5, which would make it half the resolution. But what I want to do is just go New Comp Width, and I'm just going to type in there 720, and then hit Scale. And now, if I just get rid of that, you'll see that my comp is 720 by 405. And if I go to 100% here, you'll see that it actually takes up half the space that it did before, and therefore half the render time, and it allows me to sort of play with the scene a little bit more because it's lower res. So there's a lot of reasons why you would want to down res a comp, but you can also up res a comp the same way. If I highlight that, I can just go File and Script, Scale Composition, and I can go New Comp Size 1280 and Scale, and it goes back up to its original comp size. I could actually start scaling multiple comps just by clicking on the Script and Scale Composition. I could do this comp here. I could go New Comp Width 720 and Scale, and then with this still out in the window, I could select a different comp and leave the settings as is and hit you notice there that it's 1280 by 720 over in our project window, and I could hit Scale, and notice now it's 720 by 405, and so it's inherited those, and I could do that for all of the comps. Be aware though that what I've actually done, if I look at the master comp here, the scale is what is being affected, the scale of the layers. So if I bring them all up here and hit S, all of the layers have changed to 56.2%, which is the amount of scale that was needed to take it to 720 wide. So just be aware of that, because certain comps it doesn't always look exactly like the result that you want it to look like. So definitely be aware of that. Okay, that's a look at some of the tips that or some of the tricks that I use in a production environment to really shortcut some of the headaches, some of the repetitive tasks. It's all about time. Once you become good at what you do, then it's about how fast you can do it, which makes you a valuable entity in a production environment. So learning these little tips is a great way to sort of shortcut those sorts of headaches and to really sort of work on that time allocation for deadlines. So I hope you've enjoyed these little tips, and until next time, I'm Dave Scotland for AE Toots. Bye for now.